Cool, thank you. Hi, my name is Prash, and I'm a psychedelichiatrist. And I'm here to talk to you about a word that I made up. Example alpha. Psychedelichiatry, or psychedelic psychiatry. It's a world that is as yet not all that explored. It's still in quite its early stages, and we're still unsure whether it's going to be a brave new world or the marriage of heaven and hell, which, if any of you who have read both those books, are both books by Aldous Huxley that all of you should read.
Great heavy metal albums.
Yes, that I learned today as well, both great heavy metal albums. Before I begin, and so that no one's really going to self-reveal too much, I just want to get a gauge of the audience, because I'm going to pitch this. I don't know how I'm going to pitch this. So to anyone, I was trying to find out who's had much experience in psychedelics and who has not. Thank you for self-revealing. But I was going to say, for anyone who hasn't had any experience with psychedelics, because I can see you and you can't see me or each other. You can't see each other. Can you close your eyes if you've had no experience with psychedelics? Cool. Thank you. All right. I work at the Alfred Hospital in the Psychiatry Department. I'm the drug and alcohol consult for the Alfred Hospital. I run a group called Psychonauts Anonymous, which is a sort of, it's a collection of people who are in some way intellectually connected to the psychedelic paradigm, who sit around to discuss research papers. It's sort of like psychedelic pseudo-intellectual soggy biscuit. And I work with the Australian Psychedelic Society. One of the founding members is here, Dean, out in the front there. We'll talk about that in a bit later. But that's kind of my involvement in the psychedelic space. I thought I'd start by talking about what psychedelics are. By the way, this is a PowerPoint presentation. It's no fancy keynote. It's not a fancy presentation, because I'm a doctor. So I thought I'd start by talking about what psychedelics are, and principally, psychedelics were first, the word psychedelic was first coined by Humphrey Osmond. Was one of the early psychedelic researchers. He was writing to Aldous Huxley, and he penned the verse, "To fathom hell or soar angelic, take a pinch of psychedelic." The term psychedelic coming from the Greek psyche, meaning mind, and delos, meaning manifest, to manifest all states of the mind. And that, I think, sort of describes the psychedelic experience quite well. We're going to go into some of the details on psychedelics. I'll briefly touch on some of the key protagonists in the game. Acid, or LSD. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. The Beatles claimed this had nothing to do with acid. Go figure. LSD was first synthesized. LSD was actually first synthesized a long time before it came into existence. It was first synthesized, it was an ergotamine derivative synthesized by Sandoz Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland, in 1938. But it was largely ignored because they couldn't find any use for it as a respiratory stimulant, which is what they thought it would do. And then in 1943, the 16th of April 1943, Albert Hofmann was experimenting with it when he accidentally ingested a dose of it, and got home and found that funny things were happening. So 3 days later, on the 19th of April 1943, he dosed himself with, if I'm right, 200 micrograms of LSD, got on his bicycle and rode home. Or tried to ride home. This was the world's first intentional acid trip, and to this day, the 19th of April is celebrated around the world as Bicycle Day, and I think more people take acid on that day than on any other day in the year. Acid commonly comes in little blotter paper pieces, although it's available as a liquid form or in powder form. But if you ever see any of these lying around on the ground somewhere, pick it up, put it in your pocket, don't lick it, keep it for another day. The San Pedro cactus, this is another one of the protagonists. This is from whence mescaline is extracted, another very potent psychedelic that came into prominence with the release probably of Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception and the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which outlines an afternoon in his life where Humphrey Osmond, who we spoke about earlier, visits Aldous Huxley, doses him with mescaline, and then him and Huxley's wife fall follow him throughout the day, and while Huxley relates his experiences, and that is recorded in this book. The title, Doors of Perception, actually comes from a William Blake poem from 1798, where Blake writes, "For when the doors of perception are cleansed, man will see the world for what it truly is, infinite, for he sees the world through the narrow chinks of his cavern," which I think is another great description of what the psychedelic experience does for us. And then there are mushrooms, or very varied forms. Magic mushrooms, the active ingredient in which is psilocybin. I won't go into it in too much detail. And ayahuasca, which has got a bit of a cult following recently. The active ingredient in ayahuasca is DMT. Predominantly, but ayahuasca has become known mostly for sending heaps of tourists into the jungle in Peru, into the Amazon, really. But we'll move on from some of the protagonists to, this is what's next. I was going to spend some time talking about the trip and what the psychedelic trip actually is like. Thank you. It's largely no, thank you. It's largely a fruitless exercise because it is such a phenomenological experience. It is such a phenomenon that we are limited by this very blunt tool we call language to try and describe something which you can only experience. But I will try. I think of five main categories of what it does. First, it's hallucinations in multiple perceptual modalities. So that could be visual. It's commonly visual hallucinations or auditory hallucinations, but it can involve tactile hallucinations, taste hallucinations. The important thing to point out in this is that it's not, as many people think it is, you're not going to see pink elephants flying through the room. It doesn't put into place things that are not there. It merely allows you to see what is already there from a completely new light. To use Huxley's sort of analogy, it opens the doors of perception. This idea that we all have perceptual filters through which we modulate the way we experience the world around us. And if those perceptual filters are widened, if that doors of perception are cracked open just a little bit, then all of a sudden you become exposed to the breadth of perceptual stimuli out there. And that changes the way you see the world, potentially forever. Synesthesia is another common component of the psychedelic experience, the idea where you perceive one perceptual stimulus in a completely different perceptual modality. So the idea of tasting music or seeing a taste, which again are very obtuse concepts to try and describe until you've experienced it. I'm going to gloss over it because I'll run out of time otherwise. But perhaps the most cardinal element of the entire psychedelic experience are two things: the ego disillusion that comes from it, this reduction of one's inner narcissistic sort of scaffolding of one's ego, the anti-cocaine, if you will have it, as so, and the return to this sort of existential awakening, this knowing, this being blessed with a knowledge that one did not have before. I think that probably is the key element of the whole experience. I was on to something here. The mantis shrimp. The mantis shrimp looks like the predecessor of the modern day clown, until you realize that the mantis shrimp has 3 different eyeballs and this complex visual processing system that allows it to perceive 12 different wavelengths. We can see 3. The mantis shrimp can see colors that we don't even know exist, which is phenomenal. But more than anything, it is evidence to this idea that the reality that we all perceive, this objective reality that we all hold so strongly onto, is merely a figment of our own imagination, or rather a figment of our own limitations, the limitations of our perceptual filters. I kind of jumped ahead and already talked about it because I got too enthusiastic, but that makes this slide redundant. But I'll move on to the science bit of it. Is that the timer? Is that how long I've been going? Yep. That's good. Okay. This is David Nutt, which is a very unfortunate name if you're a psychiatrist. He is. He's a psychopharmacologist, and he was the head of the UK's government advisory body on drugs, and he was sacked for essentially saying that LSD and MDMA are safer than horse riding, which is a very dangerous thing to say if you're in the UK, because they apparently take horse riding quite seriously, as he found out. But Nutt also did perform the seminal study, and this is a terrible image, but you sort of get what I'm getting at. The seminal study into drug harm, splitting it between harm to self and harm to others, and this is something some of you may already sort of be intuitively aware of, the idea that alcohol sits here and tobacco sits here, and you've got ice, crack cocaine, and heroin in between. And number 17, you've got cut, which is a root that the Ethiopians chew predominantly. And beneath that, you've got MDMA, LSD, and magic mushrooms. And yet these three are Schedule A substances. It's mushroom picking season at the moment. Yeah. And if you go out to state forests, I haven't seen it personally, but I've had enough friends who've been out picking at state forests and who have seen police cars waiting outside the state forest. Because if a mushroom is in the ground, it's a mushroom, and the moment you pick it, you're in possession of a Class A drug, which is pretty phenomenal. Anyway. More science. So the main purpose of my talk was to talk about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. That was all just an introduction. The main purpose was to talk about the therapeutic uses of psychedelics, which is where I see it going forward. But the idea of psychedelic research is not new. Between 1950 and 1970, the US government funded 119 trials in total into psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies, predominantly funded by the CIA, but that's another story altogether. And then in 1970, Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, and everything went underground, mainly because everything was now all of a sudden illegal. But in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, psychedelic research has been making a resurgence. This is one of the earliest articles. Psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance, which I think translates to the shit's good. That's why they brought a doctor up here to translate. But that's one of the early trials. This I've blatantly plagiarized from an article which I'm going to reference later, so it's not plagiarizing, I think, from Science magazine. It's not the most current, but it does give a sort of good overview of some of the trials happening around the world. Forget about the details. What you need to know is that there are a lot of them, and they're all over the world, and that none of them are in Australia. Some of the uses of psychedelics in therapy. This is one of the trials into psilocybin for psilocybin for end-of-life terminal anxiety, which makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. We spend a lot of time trying to live better. Why not learn how to die better? And that's when this has really come into the fore, to induce a sort of existential awakening that happens, that can help catalyze the process of accepting one's own mortality better. And at places like NYU and at Johns Hopkins, these trials are now running and being offered to palliative care patients. This is a study at UCL, Carhart Harris and co. Into psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Just very briefly, based on depression scores, these are baseline scores. These are 1 week scores, quite a dramatic drop, and yes, a bit of an increase, but there's some level of sustained improvement even at 3-month scores. This is with treatment-resistant depression. Treatment-resistant depression, from a psychiatric point of view, is when you've had adequate trials of at least 3 different antidepressants, and adequate trials would be at least 6 months. So that's a pretty good goal. And if you're getting reductions with a drug that is not currently something we can use, it certainly points at something that needs to be investigated further. Granted, these sample sizes in these studies are small, which is something I'll come back to later. This study had 12 participants. The sample studies are still small. That's something to bear in mind. This is one of the treatment rooms at some of the psilocybin trials. If you ignore what looks like a giant dildo in the background, apart from that, it is. But now you do. Patients lie down. They have blindfolds on them to cut out visual stimuli. They're plugged into earphones with music playing, and there are two therapists in the room who guide them through the experience at their own pace, at their own leisure. One thing I found particularly interesting was I missed out the. Did I have Kalin? Oh, no. There's a guy called Mendel Kalin at UCL whose entire job is to design the playlist. Well, I think that's not his entire job. He's also a postdoctoral fellow. But I like to think his entire job is to design, he's also a DJ, is to design the playlist that people trip to. That's a very cool job. Okay. Again, this is going to bore you after a while. This is just a way of, I was attempting to demonstrate the various different drugs that are being used in these studies. So acid being used for anxiety with high mortality illnesses. One of the most exciting uses is the use of MDMA, which I guess isn't a traditional psychedelic. We often talk about it as a psychedelic-like substance, but the use of MDMA in PTSD. So at the University of South Carolina, they've got the biggest study running with veterans, returned veterans with PTSD. And some of the results, again, this is before treatment with psychotherapy alone, and that's with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. Yeah, graphs always make things look better than they actually are, as statistics tend to do. But I think it's important to point out that it was sustained. That was the 2-month mark, and that was at 3.5 years. Which I think is pretty impressive. PTSD is one of those conditions that I think most psychiatry we term treatment resistive. It's not necessarily treatment resistant, but it tends to just be resistive to treatment. It's a really, really hard thing to get on top of, and we really don't have a good treatment for it. So to have something that could potentially be a good treatment for it is pretty damn promising. The studies in MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Science. They're the sort of peak organization that coordinates a lot of the studies, a sort of mentor organization, and their MDMA studies are happening in quite a few places around the world. Dean, can you comment on this? Yeah, neither can I. I don't know what that's about. So as we know, it isn't happening. It looks good, yeah. One of the main problems is that pure hospital grade or research grade MDMA, apart from being something that we all want to get our hands on, is also extremely expensive. So MAPS has chosen the very 21st century method of trying to get money for it by crowdfunding and crowdsourcing their finances. In fact, Dean and the crew, the group, which is now the Australian Psychedelic Society, organised one of the first fundraising dinners, or possibly the only fundraising event in Australia at the Florey Institute. What was that, a year ago, Dean? Yeah, about a year ago, raising money and sending money across to, I think he sent it to MAPS. But there's another event coming up, which is next Sunday. I've just gotten permission from Rick to kind of spruik it because I think it's for a good cause. The Psychedelic Science Conference just finished in San Francisco, and they're running a review of the conference, and it's again, I think it's a worthwhile event going to. There'll be flyers sort of lying around where you can approach Dean, who's the man in the corner in the white t-shirt there. Psychedelics have also been used, again, in trial phases for use in addiction. Now, this is something that trips people out in the addiction phase. So you're telling me you're going to use a drug to treat a drug, which seems really counterintuitive, or to treat a drug addiction, until you start to try and define what a drug actually is. When you're talking about psychedelics, 3 important things that I'd like to point out. Psychedelics have 0 addiction potential. It's a big claim, but I will make it. If you can bring me someone who is physiologically addicted to a psychedelic, I will resign. Psychedelics have no overdose potential. Yes, you potentially will have a very, very bad trip, and you may be very different forever, but there's... Could I have phrased that better? But you cannot physiologically overdose on it. You can take 1,000 times a dose of LSD. There's a story about I was going to talk about a party at, sorry?
Is it a glass of orange juice?
No, it wasn't a glass of orange. It was a party at Jar Jar Gabor's house, where sometime in the 1970s, where a bunch of people found a bag of white powder at this party, and thought, as you would if you find a bag of white powder, that it's possibly cocaine, and racked it up and snorted it. It wasn't. It was LSD tartrate powder. The microfilms of the hospital records of all 8 people are stored in the what's the institute in San Francisco? Hefter Institute? No.
Make it up.
Beckley, yeah, anyway, that institute. But you can see the actual microfilms. All 8 were taken to hospital. All 8 had nosebleeds, some of them had intestinal bleeds. All 8 were spontaneously discharged within 36 hours. 5 were available for 6-month follow-up and reported no long-lasting physiological side effects. The important thing to note here is that each of them did a line, which if you're talking about an average of a bag, which is about 1 gram, divided by 8, let's make it 10, about 100 milligrams. It's 100 milligrams of acid. If you consider that a dose of acid is approximately 100 micrograms, it's about 1,000 times an overdose. You have 1,000 times of potatoes. You have 1,000 times an overdose of potatoes, and you tell me what happens to you. I know of very little substances you can take 1,000 times of and still be physiologically okay. Quite different from psychologically okay. I'm running out of time. I'll move on. Worth knowing that Bill Wilson, one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, was one of the first people to uptake psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy into treatment of alcoholics. This is all the way back in the 60s. I'm just going to move on. Which brings us to a bit of shameless self-spruiking, but this is my article in the Australian New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry, but mainly the article is making the point about the fact that we have nothing here. Australia is very, very far behind in the psychedelic realm, at least in the therapy. And I think in Melbourne's probably the epicenter of attempts at psychedelic research, but we haven't gotten very far. Any attempts at trying to get psychedelic research passed keeps getting turned down at ethics approval stage, because obviously it is illegal, immoral, and endangers human life to research these substances. So no, we haven't gotten very far in this country. I'm going to finish. My main point here, I guess, I pointed out earlier that the sample sizes of the studies are very small, and yes, they are, and that's one of the criticisms of all the research. Oh, well, your studies are too small, or there isn't enough research out there. Well, then let us research it. Don't clamp it down. Don't hide it in the back room in a dusty cupboard and say, oh, well, there isn't enough research, so we can't let you research it because. And my second point is there are all these conditions we call treatment resistant. There's treatment resistant depression, treatment resistant PTSD. How can you truly call something treatment resistant when you know there's a potential treatment that could work and you don't try it? You can't. The problem here still seems to be our inability to research it and to progress this forward. I'm drawing on the example that happened in medical marijuana, medical cannabis, that has since seen legalization for research purposes, and a large part of that was research funding. A lot of money from a very rich philanthropist's grandfather, whose granddaughter had treatment-resistant epilepsy that responded to CBD oil. This is shamelessly me asking for money. If you know of any philanthropist, if you know anyone who's made a lot of money on Bitcoin today, and who happens to have a son who has PTSD or a daughter with treatment-resistant depression, let us know. We want their money. But more than that, my business partner, so I do run a Bitcoin trading desk, and my business partner is in New York at the Consensus Conference, a big blockchain conference, and he texted me this morning, I can't find it here, something along the line. I asked him how things were going, and he replied saying, it's like 5,000 people trying to buy and sell their own version of the future, which I thought was pretty poetic. I'm not going to tell you what the future looks like, but I like to think that this will be part of it. Thank you.